there's going to be, I hope, what will seem like productive overlap with some of what has already been said today. Maybe insistence, perhaps. And I'm realizing as I look at this first slide, I should say, well, two things. One is my PowerPoints are legendarily woeful, so just chuckle as you feel moved to. But with this first slide, I need to thank my hand model who's sitting in the first row. And then also a shout out to the I hear them as voices right now, but my goddaughter is in the room and her big sister, and it makes me really happy that they're here. All right. Well, the goal here is to take us to the cup of hot coffee held handle out, which is a micro moment in the late American writer Lucia Berlin's short story, The Adobe House with a Tin Roof. There are a few stops to make before we get to this emblematic gesture in an emblematic story by a writer who feels ever more necessary to me. You'll forgive, I hope, the anecdotal, not to say scattershot nature of these remarks on the subject of self-undermining, self-minimizing, self-obscuring, and even self-obliterating in autobiographical endeavor. What I offer here is not meant to be comprehensive any more than it's meant to be prescriptive. I've dipped my own toes in the waters of autobiographical inquiry, and am interested in thinking, fail better, about ways said inquiry might be conducted more interestingly. I'll say as I enter that I was appreciative yesterday of the remarks made by Marie and Anne, as well as by Robin, to do with reasons why, in context both particular and general, one might think twice about honoring or embracing or acquiescing to the label. We spend all our time trying to write and think our way out from under hegemonic imperatives, and then, thanks world, here come the categories. So thank God for the Gwendolyn Brookses or the Zora Neale Hurstons or the Henri Bales or the Moi Montaignes, comme Marie l'a dit, or the Lucia Berlins. During his shepherding of the post-afternoon panel conversation, Kevin used the phrase, a gesturing toward. That's what I'd like to imagine I'm up to here. If I begin by mentioning the late writer Bobby Louise Hawkins and pointing out that for many years she called herself Bobby Creeley, this is not because in persons Hawkins herself so frequently evoked what she called her Creeley, as in the poet Robert, period, back when I was with Creeley, she would say, but because she spent so many years in so many different pieces building that tranche of her experience onto the page. She wrote poems about it. She wrote stories about it. She wrote novels about it, poems, stories, and novels that weren't possible to devote herself to when she was actually married to Creeley, because poverty, because kids, because patriarchy, because lots of wine, because fuck it, because there were always at all hours big personality poets turning up at the house. And she was the one, back to that patriarchy piece, the cooking and cleaning fell to. Still, Hawkins made art in those years. She wrote poems in secret. She became the famous talker she never stopped being. She became a character in the stories of her writer friends. She became, more importantly, a character in her own work, but not, and this is a theme we'll return to, necessarily the main one. With Back to Texas, published in 1977, 2 years after her break with Creeley, which feels notable, she returned to the West Texas of her early years with a tape recorder. Not one she clunked down onto the tables and TV sets and dashboards of the aunts, cousins, close family, and community elders she sought out, but one she concealed, sometimes literally, up her sleeve. Tell me the one about Uncle Pete, she'd say, or remind me of that time we went over to Betty's. And here I'm interested in the ways in which this project does or doesn't overlap with Gabriella's. We'll touch briefly later on the more widely known work with a tape recorder of Svetlana Alexievich, but setting the mechanism aside, I want to point to what feels relevant here about Hawkins' first book-length work of autobiographical prose. A writer who has been told implicitly by her culture and explicitly by her partner that she can't/won't write, slays the Medusa of her doubters by reflecting in the place she grew up, her very gently fictionalized self into being. And on screen is just a little taste of this. In a note on the method contained in the book, she says the work has been more gathered than written, that this method of gathering, or perhaps gleaning, to evoke Agnès Varda among others, by drawing others out, means further sublimating herself into voices and stories in which she often figures only indirectly or indeed not at all, is of a piece with her evolving predilections. Hawkins' voice in all the works that follow was always plural, and there's some nice echo with Asmina, talking about Amina Kane. If her two best accents on the page and off were West Texas and somewhat more British than the British, she had many others up under her hat. And they, like herself, were refracted across the pages of subsequent works like Frenchie and Cuban Pete, One Small Saga, and My Own Alphabet. She emerged then for herself and us shard by bright, barely fictional shard. The autobiographical impulse in her was strong, but never interested in capturing anything like the all of it. Not for nothing did Reynolds Price refer to her with deep admiration as a great American miniaturist. There was never any question for Hawkins of writing 1,000 pages or a few thousand pages on the subject of her days, as, say, Proust did. Indeed, she has a terrific piece about buying and selling and buying again and or losing, and never at any rate finishing in search of lost time. I studied with her in Boulder, Colorado in the 90s. She was working on a new book in those days. She really did come back again and again to the subject about her life with Creeley. She was feeling good about it and calling herself, that particular permutation of herself, Margaret. We've made too much for too long of the letter E when it comes to the gigantic variorum that was and is the work of Georges Perec, so I'll avoid here doing anything more than signaling the act of extraordinary self-masking that underwrites his 1969 novel La Disparition, or A Void in Gilbert Adair's translation, in which the indispensable, or at least the most frequently used letter in the French and English language, E, is disallowed, just as the indispensable person, Perec's mother, after the 1940 death of his father, fighting for his adopted country, his parents were recent immigrants from Poland, was disallowed by the Nazis. The letter W, too, looms large in Perec's personal imaginary. Double V, or W in French, which comes tantalizingly close to double vie, double life, a morsel of wordplay that works fairly well in English with our double U pronunciation. Apt governing letter, at any rate, for a two-threaded autobiographical work in which Perec takes a stab at the question posed in Raymond Queneau's epigraph. That mindless mist where shadows swirl, how could I pierce it? Does he succeed in the pages that follow? Not sure. In one thread, which begins with the line, I have no childhood memories, and relies on yellowing snapshots, a handful of eyewitness accounts, and a few paltry documents to prop up his implausible memories, he conjures, the word is his, a gone world marked by trauma and absence that would never, at least not on the page, fully cohere. In the other thread, an intriguingly Baconian and increasingly Dantesque journey to W, a fictional nation in the region of Tierra del Fuego, which is obsessed with sport and discipline, and which is obviously a stand-in for Germany in the 30s and 40s, unfolds. Presented in alternating chapter, Perec braids his two threads, which are informed by the fictions of memory and the fictions of imagination, with maximum matter of factness. Horror is the ground of the metaphor of the recreated childhood he presents, and horror is the referent for the allegorical nightmare gymnasium of a country that is W. That the childhood Perec does his best to recreate from a limited personal archive is approximate at best, is mirrored or doubled, or perhaps we should say exacerbated, by the fact that the first-person narrator in the W chapters both is and isn't Perec, sort of Perec. Where is Georges? This question, which I was moved to ask after my first reading the book and after my second and more recently after my third, sounds to my ears, at least, like the not-so-unlikely name of a punk band, and allows me to confidently, or at least somewhat confidently, open a parenthetical. To wit, in which ways, the ways in which the two threads in W, or the memory of childhood, both create and obliterate a self, and the fact that my daughter just the other day met Patti Smith, puts me in mind of that punk ethos which we find in Kathy Acker on and off the page, or the Ramones, or the Cramps, or the dead Kennedys on and off the stage. And that's a phrase that's already been used just a moment ago. An ethos of volcanic presence absence might seem out of step with cups of hot coffee unless they are being tossed in faces, held handle out in New Mexican adobe houses with tin roofs. But on another day, there might be a great deal to be said about the autofictions that emerged from the lo-fi DIY aesthetics of zine culture and the punk world. But to return to the question of how to pierce that mindless mist, or put otherwise, where is Georges? I don't know. And maybe Perec didn't either. He was, after all, the author of the work we started this stop with, A Void, a work in which his own E-rich name would, if the rules were followed as strictly as in decidedly fascist W, not even be allowed to appear. We might usefully think then of that moment in Hisham Matar's The Return, about trying to find his father who was murdered under ultimately unknowable circumstances by the Gaddafi regime, when he writes, I was back in that familiar place, a place of shadow where the only way to engage with what happened is through the imagination, an activity that serves only to excite the past, multiplying the possibilities, like a house with endless rooms, inescapable and haunted. Perec, the inventor of databases, writer of crosswords, creator of famously complex structures for his books, remains a lively presence in his riotously inventive works. But Georges, that one's harder. That one interests me. Brakhage meets Tarkovsky is told to Jennifer Dorn, which I encountered in the pages of the Chicago Review, though it first appeared in longer form in Dorn's Boulder-based collaborative literary newspaper, Rolling Stock, sheds light on an extraordinary encounter that took place on the fringes of the 1983 Telluride Film Festival. In it, Stan Brakhage describes showing his films to Andrei Tarkovsky in a tiny 6x10 hotel room, and the explosively negative reaction he received to Window Water Baby Moving, Dog Star Man, Part 4, Untitled Number 6, Made Manifest, and others. The scene is wild. The films are projected right onto faded hotel wallpaper. There are 8 hot bodies in the room. Tarkovsky keeps going ballistic in Russian, and his translator hands over the substance of what he's saying to Brakhage, whose heart is absolutely breaking for the films. Brakhage defends them nonetheless. Here's a taste of the exchange. What is this? It doesn't mean anything. It's just capricious. And I'm coming back and saying, shut up and look, and you'll see there's a melodic line. And shapes don't just occur anywhere in the frame. There's a balance. But what does it mean? What do you mean, what does it mean? You have a lot of statements about music in your films, but this isn't the same as music, and then it goes on and on. Indeed, it does. Although the seance finally ends in a fizzle when a very bad film, something Brakhage and Tarkovsky can apparently agree on, by an unnamed Russian emigre is screened. Fortunately, there's an epilogue to the story. A Polish animator, Rybczynski, who was one of the 8 in the room, catches up with Brakhage the next day and, after haranguing him about the irrelevance of art, brushes aside Brackage's disclaimers about the poor viewing conditions for his films, shown on wallpaper, no one would shut up, etc., with the following. Don't you know that Tarkovsky went on talking about this for the rest of the day? For 2 hours they were raging and carrying on, and he's still talking about it. He said he'd known Tarkovsky for years on and off in Poland, and many people think he's taken a vow of silence like an Andrei Rublev. For weeks he'll never say a word. He said he'd never heard him talk so much all at once, and he said, I'm very jealous. He said he'd never seen him so excited about anything and that my films would cast a shadow through his work. Tarkovsky only had 3 years left to live after the encounter, so the question of whether any Brakhagian shadow was paid forward is debatable. Still, it was in reading that last bit that I felt a flicker of recognition. To do with Brakhage? I love his films, but no. To do with Tarkovsky? Even more so, but ditto. No. The truth is, once the hotel hijinks and great dude encounters settle in the mind, what particularly interests me about this piece is the shadow of writer, filmmaker, and editor Jennifer Dorn, who throughout is being told to by Brakhage. What precisely does it mean here to be told to? The piece itself doesn't say. I reached out to Dorn, who told me that she recorded, then transcribed, and inevitably neatened and shaped. She was pretty circumspect about this, Brackage's remarks, which of course offers us an echo of certain aspects of Bobby Louise Hawkins' method in Back to Texas, with the key difference that Dorn leaves herself entirely out of it except for those 5 words, in the title. Even when the piece was excerpted and repackaged for the Chicago Review, she didn't metabolize the encounter into self-illuminating memoir, a la "One night in 1983, after a few drinks, Stan said to me," or "Let me tell you about how things went when I showed my movies to that expletive Tarkovsky." Instead of back to Texas here, we might then think more usefully of Svetlana Alexievich's symphonic oral histories in works like Voices from Chernobyl, Englished by Keith Gesson. Though Alexievich is, of course, always there during the thousands of hours of interviews she conducts, she allows post-culling, editing, and shaping only the most occasional indications of her own presence into the proceedings. And here we have Alexievich present simply in a parenthesis that gives a little bit of context to what's being said at the end of that first full paragraph. And then this one is charming. Alexievich has not culled the reference to lady at the top of the page. "Tell me, lady, how could it be that I wouldn't be born?" That lady is Alexievich, but that's about all you get as you move through this. She's there. She was there, just as Dorn was and is there. Both are being told to. Both, and this is key, are impacting in ways that, given the evidence, are hard to determine what is being told to them. They are what precisely is missing in the ChatGPT paradigms described by Marie yesterday. I'll resist more than a passing reference here to the very different project of being told to that Rachel Cusk so tirelessly pursues in fictional mode in her outline triptych. With Dorn and Alexievich, it's different. Both allow a whisper of themselves into the mix of the telling, but no more. Sometimes, though, a whisper is enough, is what I'm thinking. Might be about time for the coffee back there, but I want to break out just a couple more parentheticals before we pour. Here, perhaps more than anywhere, I return to that phrase of Kevin's, that gesturing toward. So the first parenthetical is the ways in which translation, again, some echo here, might come into a conversation like the one unfolding during Why Me? The ways in which the work of the translator from the text she translates to the way she translates it reveals a self or selves. More than one major translator, as we know, has written a memoir, and here I give a shout to Rosemary Waldrop's inimitable, lavish absence about her decades of engaging with Edmond Jabez. But I'm thinking more specifically about the ways in which the act of translation itself already accomplishes some analogous and perhaps even more revelatory task, and wondering in what ways a self might in fact be quite emphatically expressed in words that are almost all one's own, but almost all suggested by an other. Interpreters, that exalted group who relanguage almost as quickly as language appears, blurring as they do the line between first and second origin and target, might be even more interesting to consider in this context. Then the second parenthetical is this. In a recent chat with fourth-year Brown student Corinne Leong, during which Corinne noted that the great Italian novelist Natalia Ginzburg relied almost exclusively on fiction to write very directly about her life, the subject of Elena Ferrante's Neapolitan Quartet came up. During our conversation, we touched on a possibly related inquiry connected to pseudonyms, the fictional scrim they place between an unnamed author, or perhaps authors plural in the case of Ferrante, and a text. The Neapolitan Quartet was widely believed to be autobiographical, a contention supported and elaborated on through interviews and essays by the fiction known as Elena Ferrante. In other words, really tracking life experience, lived experience, is what I mean by that. And that contention was undercut by revelations by an investigative journalist. Not decided, but undercut. I'm not, though many were, particularly interested in who is behind Ferrante, but I'm interested in this context that we're in all together, in what gets done or perhaps undone when a fiction is construed and or counted on as the author of a work. The heteronyms of Fernando Pessoa would of course need to be part of the conversation were this to be further explored. At any rate, thanks, Corinne. So we're coming into the home stretch here. In a foreword to the posthumous 2018 gathering of Lucia Berlin's stories, Evening in Paradise, Berlin's eldest son, Mark, writes, "Ma wrote true stories, not necessarily autobiographical, but close enough for horseshoes. Our family stories and memories have been slowly reshaped, embellished, and edited to the extent that I'm not sure what really happened all the time. Lucia said this didn't matter. The story is the thing. Berlin wrote her true stories for decades, starting in the 60s, but only publishing her first book, Angel's Laundromat, in 1981. And if her truth, it needs to be said, encompassed some rather glamorous early experience, for this reader, the stories that sing, and there are many of them, are the ones that take up, reshaped, embellished, edited her years as cleaning woman, telephone switchboard operator, emergency room receptionist, and naive by her own account, young wife. And here we arrive at a paradox, perhaps one that has been implicit in all the stops we've made and parentheticals we've opened and closed. Because if Berlin and her avatars in the Adobe in the Adobe house with a tin roof, the name she uses is Maya, almost always sit left of center of life's neon lights, its brass bands, its rush of uniforms and ambulance alarms, its art monster wannabe men. You can pick your metaphor, some of whom she is married for, the truth she molds and puts on the page quite quietly, inconspicuously, unostentatiously, sings loud. Here's the first page of the story in which we find that cup of coffee. Try to read just a little bit of this. I have to bend over, I can barely see it. And I'm sure that you can't see it very well. Again, the poor PowerPoint play I'm working here. The house was 100 years old, rounded and wind-softened, the same rich brown as the hard earth around it. There were other buildings on the land, a corral, an outhouse, a chicken pen, a small adobe squatted near the south wall of the main house. It didn't have a tin roof like the big house. Smooth and symmetrical, it seemed to have sprung up like a dusty mushroom out of the dirt. There were 4 acres of rundown land, 20 apple trees about to bloom, dried corn stalks, a rusted hand plow, a thrasher with a curved beak sat under a bare cottonwood by the red pump. Water gushed from the pump when Paul tried it. Most of the windows were broken, the doors ajar. Inside it was cool and dark and smelled of pinon cedar. Another pungent scent came from a curtain made of eucalyptus berries and red beads. And I'll skip ahead to the next page just to evoke that particular sentence in question, out of which the title of this talk was birthed. Still only 19, she had no idea what being a good wife meant. And then here's the sentence. She did things like hold the hot part of the cup when she passed him being Paul, her husband, coffee, offering him the handle. So it's held handle side out. And this is a phrase that Berlin has taken almost, she is quoting herself from a memoir in which she describes her own experience, lest one imagine that this particular moment was perhaps an act of imagination. Not that it matters, but she has 2 versions of it almost identical, one in a memoir and one in a short story. So there's the focus in on that particular sentence. At any rate, this is to borrow from Lydia Davis, who wrote a foreword to the first posthumous gathering of Berlin's stories, a manual for cleaning women, exhilarating writing. But it's not, and it is almost never, like the characters who inhabit it, flashy. Berlin was a contemporary of signal late 20th century American prose innovators, people like Kathy Acker, Toni Morrison, Robert Coover, William Gass, John Barth, who passed so recently, and Ishmael Reed. She was also surrounded during the majority of her adulthood by resolute avant-gardists in music, visual art, and poetry. Yet in story after story in the Adobe house with a tin roof is, as we've seen, no exception. Rather than genuflect before the altar of structural and syntactical experimentation, rather than interrogate and deconstruct, she dresses her truths in the serviceable drab of mid-century realism. I've just evoked one Waldrop, so it seems reasonable to evoke another, Keith Waldrop's Light While There Is Light, one of the great autobiographical explorations of a poet coming of age in the latter part of the last century, penned by someone who was no stranger in his poetry and translations to the wonders of experiment, is cut from similarly understated cloth. You could easily imagine returning to Berlin, the stories themselves, and not just some of the characters in them, engaged in a Saturday afternoon game of horseshoes. Annie Ernaux has already come up multiple times in different and much more interesting ways, so I won't belabor this. But a mention of her oft celebrated écriture plate feels important here. Flat writing being the only way, is the shot, Ernaux can conceive of committing to paper the lived experience of parents who raised her in rooms above a small grocery store cafe. Unlike Ernaux, Berlin does not forego literary flourish and stylistic sleight of hand, right? She doesn't make a statement about doing this. We can debate whether Ernaux herself does it or not. That's not the point here. She's not against pivot or swerve or rhythmic elegance. The house was 100 years old, rounded and wind-softened, the same rich brown as the hard earth around it, right? But it's clear that her wordscapes serve the circumstances of the struggling, persevering, unsentimentalized versions of herself she puts over and over again onto the page. The implication in The Adobe House with a Tin Roof is that experience would alter the dispensation, that Berlin's young doppelganger would eventually learn better, that she would modify the self-abnegating behavior and quit hurting her own hand, and by extension, quit putting up with boring jerks. But the years and years of stories that go in on different parts of Berlin's life, and they keep going in on her life, right, say otherwise. Did the aging characters in later stories learn to know better? Sure. But there are all sorts of ways to hurt your hand and your head and your back and your heart, and the jerks, well, they keep showing up. And yet, even so, but still. In a sense, the characters in the majority of Berlin's stories, which consistently have an atemporal aspect of autoportraiture, rich in detail, poor in incident, outsized in import, never stop holding the hot part of the cup. And therein, for this reader, compelled by autobiographical endeavor, but hungry to look away from, or through, or past some of what the literary moment of the last dozen or so years has had most visibly on offer, lies the model of their power. In A Shape in the Water, which can be found in her excellent first collection, Jack Kerouac is Pregnant, the late Orly Sheehan gives us the image of a beaver swimming across a lake. The surface of the water is smooth, reflecting the sky, except for a spot slowly moving forward. A V shape widens behind the animal. You can see the V shape, and that is how you know she is there. She swims quietly. Only everyone can see the arrow. Sheehan writes. And I, thinking of Texans, W's, Dorns, Belarusians, and Berlins, am inspired by this. Thank you.